The weight of the crystal chandelier felt like it was pressing down on her, each prism of light a judgmental eye. Ava smoothed the fabric of her sleeveless purple dress, a nervous gesture she hated. The silk felt too thin, the color too bold. She had chosen it to feel confident, a splash of defiant joy in a sea of black and navy. Now it felt like a spotlight. Her work was everywhere in this grand ballroom. The cascading arrangements of white orchids and deep purple calla lilies on every table, the dramatic arch of roses framing the stage. She should have been proud. She was a floral designer, and this charity gala was her biggest commission yet, a testament to her artistry. However, pride was a distant memory. It had evaporated the moment she saw him.
Blake.
Her ex, standing near the champagne fountain, looking effortlessly handsome in his tailored tuxedo. And on his arm, a woman who looked like she was carved from moonlight and disdain.
Tiffany.
A model, of course. Slender, blonde, and laughing a laugh that sounded like tiny, cruel bells. Blake's eyes scanned the room and found her. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He nudged Tiffany, pointing discreetly with his chin. They were coming over. The room tilted. Her lungs seized. She could already hear his voice, dripping with false sympathy. "Ava, you look healthy. Good for you." He had always used that word like a weapon. She had to move. Escape. But the crowd was a thick, unmoving wall of expensive suits and glittering gowns. She was trapped. Her gaze darted around, desperate for an anchor, and found one in the corner of the room. A man sat alone at a small, reserved table, a statue of stillness in the swirling chaos. He wasn't watching the party. He was observing it like a predator overlooking a watering hole. His suit was a dark charcoal, cut with such precision it seemed molded to his broad shoulders. A heavy gold signet ring was the only ornament on his hand, which rested motionlessly beside a glass of amber liquid. She knew who he was.
Enzo De Luca.
The name was a whisper in rooms like this, a name associated with shipping, construction, and shadows. The gala's primary benefactor. A man whose quiet presence made the loudest titans of industry straighten their spines. He was danger. He was power. He was her only way out. Without a second thought, driven by a primal need to rewrite the next 60 seconds of her life, Ava moved. She walked directly toward his table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He watched her approach, his dark eyes unreadable, missing nothing. She didn't slow down. She reached his table and stopped, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts.
He didn't speak.
He simply waited. She leaned down, her voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Act like you love me, please." Enzo De Luca's expression did not change. His gaze flickered over her shoulder, landing on Blake and Tiffany, who were now only a few yards away, their approach slowed by curiosity. He looked back at Ava, a long, silent assessment that stripped her bare. She felt a hot flush of shame, but she held his gaze. She had come this far. A flicker of something amusement? Intrigue? Crossed his face, so faint it was barely there. He made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and rested it on the small of her back. His touch was a shock, a brand of heat through the thin silk of her dress. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. She sank into the empty chair beside him. He slid his chair closer, his thigh pressing against hers, an immovable wall of muscle and fine wool. He leaned in, his scent enveloping her. Sandalwood and something else, something clean and cold like winter air. "What is your name?" he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Ava." "Ava," he repeated, and the way he said it was different. Not a question, but a statement of ownership. Blake and Tiffany arrived at the table. Blake's smug expression faltered, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. He saw Ava, not alone and pathetic, but intimately seated with Enzo De Luca. He saw Enzo's hand possessively on her back. "Ava," Blake began, his voice strained. "I didn't realize you knew Mr. De Luca." Enzo's eyes, cold and dark as a winter lake, lifted to meet Blake's. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his attention was a physical force. "There is a great deal you don't realize," Enzo said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the finality of a gavel. He then dismissed Blake entirely, turning his full attention back to Ava. He picked up her hand, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her wrist. "Are you enjoying the evening, my love?" The endearment was so shocking, so utterly out of place, that Ava could only stare at him. But she saw the command in his eyes. "Play along." She found her voice a little shaky, but it was there. "It's much better now." His lips curved in the barest hint of a smile, a chilling, predatory thing. "Good." Blake stood frozen, his face pale. Tiffany tugged at his arm, her perfect features pinched with unease. They were nobodies here, and they had just stumbled into the lion's den. Blake muttered a hasty apology and practically dragged Tiffany away, melting back into the crowd. The immediate threat was gone. A wave of dizzying relief washed over Ava. She started to pull her hand away, to thank Enzo and disappear. His grip tightened, not painfully, but with an unmistakable authority. He did not let go. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes on their joined hands. "You have no idea what that—" "I have a very clear idea," he cut in smoothly. "You used me to solve a problem. A temporary, insignificant problem." He leaned back in his chair, still holding her hand, turning it over to examine her palm, as if reading her future. "Now I have a problem, and you are going to solve it for me." Ava's blood ran cold. This was not a simple favor. This was a transaction, and she had just paid with a currency she didn't know she possessed. What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, finally meeting her eyes again, "that your performance was convincing." A little desperate, but convincing. He gestured vaguely at the room. "These people, the ones who run this city's legitimate businesses, they are nervous. They prefer their partners to be stable, settled. A man in my position needs a respectable woman on his arm from time to time. It soothes them." The implication dawned on her, horrifying and absolute. "You want me to pretend? To be your girlfriend?" "I don't want you to pretend," he corrected her, his voice dropping lower, each word a carefully placed stone. "You will be my companion. You will accompany me to events like this. You will sit at my table. You will smile when I tell you to. And in return," he paused, his thumb brushing over her pulse point, "your ex-boyfriend will never look in your direction again. No one will." It wasn't a proposal. It was a declaration. She had run from a poodle and straight into the jaws of a wolf. She had asked him to act, and he was now casting her in a play she had no choice but to join. The relief she had felt moments ago curdled into pure, unadulterated fear. She had solved her problem for the night, but she had created a much bigger one for the rest of her life. The next 2 weeks were a blur of tailored dresses and silent car rides. Enzo's driver, a mountain of a man named Leo, who never spoke, would appear at her small floral shop in the village. He would present her with a box containing a new dress, shoes, and a simple note with a time and an address. There was no question of refusal. It was an imperial summons. Ava learned to exist in his world. She learned the language of silence, the weight of a glance. She watched how men who controlled millions would shrink under Enzo's quiet gaze. He never raised his voice.
He never needed to.
His power was in his stillness, in the absolute certainty that his will would be done. She was his prop, a beautiful, respectable accessory meant to soften his image. At a charity auction in a museum, she stood by his side as he bid on a painting, his hand resting on her back the entire time. At a private dinner with a city councilman, she listened to them discuss zoning laws and permits, her only role to smile and look lovely. He rarely spoke to her during these events, but he was always aware of her. A subtle pressure of his hand, a look that told her to pick up her wine glass, a slight shift in his posture that brought him closer to her. It was a suffocating, choreographed intimacy. One evening, after a tense dinner with a rival family's patriarch, they were in the back of his armored sedan, gliding through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon and gold. "The Falcone family," she said, breaking the heavy silence. They don't like you. Enzo was staring out the window, his face cast in shadow. The feeling is mutual. Why? The question was out before she could stop it. It was too direct, too personal. He turned his head, his dark eyes studying her in the dim light of the car. She expected a rebuke, a cold dismissal. Instead, he seemed to consider it. They operate on betrayal. It is the only currency they understand. He looked away again, his jaw tight. My brother, Stefano, he was supposed to take over for my father. He was better with people than I am. He trusted them. Ava held her breath, knowing she was hearing something no one else was permitted to hear. Stefano had a man, his most trusted soldier. Grew up with us. He vouched for him, brought him into the inner circle. The man sold us out to the Falcons. Led Stefano into an ambush. Enzo's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Ava could feel the cold rage radiating from him. I was supposed to be with him that night, but I was delayed. I found him after. The wound was there, raw and deep, an adult he had failed to protect. A betrayal he could never forgive. It was the source of his coldness, his absolute refusal to trust anyone. He saw the world through the lens of that one catastrophic failure. I'm sorry, she whispered. It felt like a stupid, inadequate thing to say. He just grunted, a dismissal of her sympathy. But he had told her. He had opened a door, just a crack, and shown her the darkness inside. A few nights later, the danger ceased to be a story from the past. They were leaving a restaurant in Brooklyn, walking toward the car in a private underground garage. The air was cold and damp, smelling of concrete and exhaust fumes. Suddenly, Enzo stopped. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind him. Leo, he said, his voice a low command. Leo, who had been opening the car door, straightened up, his hand disappearing inside his jacket. A black car at the far end of the garage screeched forward, its headlights flashing on, pinning them in the harsh glare. It sped toward them. Ava's heart leaped into her throat. This was it. This was real. Enzo moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. He shoved her down behind the solid bulk of their own car, his body shielding hers. Stay down, he ordered. The sound of squealing tires filled the enclosed space. The other car didn't slow. It was going to ram them. But at the last second, it swerved, scraping against a concrete pillar with a horrific shriek of metal. Two men jumped out, guns raised. Leo was already moving, firing his own weapon. The sound was deafening in the garage, a series of sharp, violent cracks that echoed off the walls. Ava pressed herself against the cold metal of the car, her mind blank with terror. Enzo was a blur of motion beside her. He had a gun in his hand, appearing from nowhere. He fired twice, precise and economical. One of the men crumpled to the ground. The other one hesitated, then scrambled back into the car. Tires screamed again, and the black car reversed violently, smashing into the garage gate and disappearing into the night. It was over in less than 30 seconds. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Enzo straightened up, his breathing even, his expression unreadable. He looked at the man on the ground, then at Leo, who gave a slight nod. Then, he looked down at Ava. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice calm. She shook her head, unable to speak. She was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable shudder. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. He saw the terror in her eyes. This is what my world is, he said, his voice flat. This is what you stepped into. He took a step back, putting a small but significant distance between them. Leo will take you home. You don't have to do this anymore. You can go back to your flowers, your simple life. This debt is paid. He was giving her an out, an escape. She could walk away right now and never see him or his brutal world again. She should have run. Every sensible part of her screamed to run. But then she saw it. A dark gash on the back of his hand, knuckles scraped raw and bleeding where he must have hit the car when he pushed her down. And she saw the profound, absolute loneliness in his eyes. The same loneliness she had felt that night at the gala, magnified 1,000 times. He expected her to leave. Everyone always left. She made a choice. No, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I'm not going anywhere. She reached into her purse, her hands still shaking, and pulled out a small packet of tissues. She stepped toward him, into his space, and took his injured hand. His skin was warm, his muscles tense beneath her touch. He watched her, his expression guarded, as she gently dabbed at the blood. You're bleeding, she said softly. Their eyes met over his bruised knuckles. The garage was silent except for the drip of water from a pipe somewhere. In that moment, the world shrank to the space between them. He was a killer, a monster, a king in a kingdom of violence. But his hand was warm in hers, and he was letting her tend to his wound. It was the most intimate, charged moment she had ever experienced. He didn't pull away. He simply watched her, and she knew that her decision to stay had changed everything. It was no longer a performance. Therefore, the dangers were no longer just his. They were hers, too. Her world, the one with the sweet scent of lilies and the simple satisfaction of a perfect bouquet, was gone. Enzo's world had consumed it. The line between acting and being had blurred into non-existence. She still ran her shop, but her days were haunted by the nights. She found herself watching shadows, flinching at loud noises. Fear was a constant companion. She also found herself watching him. She noticed the way his grim expression would soften almost imperceptibly when he thought she wasn't looking. She learned that the slight tap of his signet ring on a table meant he was impatient. The slow rotation of it on his finger meant he was thinking. These were the secrets of his private language, and she was becoming a fluent speaker. One afternoon, she arrived at her shop to find the front window shattered, glass crunching under her feet like broken ice.
Inside, it was chaos.
Her meticulously arranged displays were overturned, flowers crushed and torn, the delicate petals bruised and ruined on the floor. And on the wall, spray-painted in crude red letters, was a single word: Falcone. A message. For him. Through her. Nausea churned in her stomach. This was her fault. Her connection to him had brought this ugliness into her one safe space. She sank to her knees amidst the wreckage of her life's work, the scent of destroyed roses filling the air, and for the first time since this began, she wept. When Enzo arrived, summoned by a panicked call from her, he took in the scene with a chilling stillness. His eyes swept over the destruction, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw her on the floor, surrounded by the carnage, and something in his expression shifted. He walked to her, knelt, and placed a hand on her shoulder. I will handle this, he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. They did this because of me, she choked out. They did this because they are weak, he countered. They attack what a man values to see if he will break. That night, in the sterile quiet of his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the rage simmered between them. He was planning a retaliation, something brutal and bloody. She could see it in the tense set of his shoulders, the way he paced before the floor-to-ceiling windows. I know something, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. He stopped pacing and turned to her. What do you know? These people, she began, thinking of the client she served, the gossip she overheard while trimming stems and tying ribbons. The rich, the powerful. They have two lives. The one everyone sees, and the one they hide. She took a breath. Marco Falcone, the old man's son. His pride and joy. The legitimate one. He throws parties. Very private, very illegal. Not just drugs. Things that would destroy his father's reputation, ruin their political connections forever. Enzo's eyes narrowed. Where? I know the caterer, she said simply. She complains about him constantly. The next one is Saturday. At a warehouse in Red Hook his father's company owns. She was giving him a weapon. Not a gun or a knife, but something far more insidious. Information. A way to cripple the Falcone family without firing a shot. It was a morally gray, ugly thing to do, to use the casual confidences of her professional life to bring about someone's ruin. She was crossing a line she could never uncross. She was becoming part of his world, using its rules. Enzo stared at her a long, searching look. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a damsel in distress, not as a prop, but as a player. An asset. You are not like them, he said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. A dangerous acknowledgement of the darkness she was capable of. You see the board differently. Her confession was her silence. She did not look away. She did not apologize for the weapon she had just handed him. In that moment, they were allies. Partners. The space between them crackled with a new, potent energy. The pretense had fallen away completely, leaving something raw and real in its place. They had a plan. They felt invincible, a team forged in crisis. But her action, her brilliant, surgical strike, had also made her a target. She was no longer just the man's woman. She was the woman who knew their secrets. The Falcons would no longer send a message. They would come for the source. The attack came 2 days later. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet and efficient. Ava was walking home from the subway, the sky a bruised purple at dusk. A van pulled up beside her. Before she could even scream, 2 men were out. A hand clamped over her mouth, and she was bundled into the darkness. It happened so fast her mind couldn't catch up. One moment she was on a familiar street, the next she was on a cold metal floor, the van speeding away, plunging her deeper into Enzo's world than she had ever imagined. She was taken to a damp, cold warehouse that smelled of rust and river water. They tied her to a chair. Marco Falcone himself stood before her, his handsome face twisted with rage. You were a mistake, he spat. A florist. You should have stayed with your pretty little flowers. Fear was a cold, solid knot in her stomach, but her mind was surprisingly clear. Panicking would get her killed. Enzo would come. She knew he would. But she couldn't just wait to be rescued. She had to do something. She had to survive. She studied her captors. Marco was a hothead, consumed by his own fury. But the other one, the older man standing by the door, he looked bored, resigned. This was a job to him, nothing more. That was her opening. He'll kill you for this, Ava said, her voice steady, directed at the older man. Not just Marco. You. Enzo de Luca doesn't leave loose ends.
Marco laughed.
He won't find you in time. You think this is about him finding me? Ava pushed on, her eyes locked on the guard. This is about what happens after. Your family, your wife, your adult sons.
He knows who you are, doesn't he?
He knows where they live. When he's done with Marco, he'll come for you. Not for revenge. Just to be neat. The guard's face paled. He shifted his weight, his bored expression replaced by a flicker of fear. She had hit a nerve. She had planted a seed of doubt. It wasn't much, but it was something. She had changed the dynamic in the room, making them think about the consequences. She wasn't just a victim. She was a voice, whispering poison into the cracks of their loyalty. The warehouse door exploded inward. It wasn't a rescue. It was an invasion. Enzo was a specter of violence at the center of it, moving with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. The fight was brutal, swift, and absolute. When the deafening noise stopped, the silence was thick with the scent of cordite. Enzo walked through the aftermath, his eyes finding hers. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt before her, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't say a word. He simply reached up and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her jawline. His touch was firm, grounding. He looked into her eyes, and she saw everything there. The fury. The fear he would never admit to. The raw, possessive relief. You are mine, he said, his voice rough. It was not a question or a romantic declaration. It was an oath. A statement of fact as solid as the concrete floor beneath them. Mine to protect. That was the cost. Her old life, her flower shop, the woman she used to be, were all gone, casualties of a war she had stumbled into. She could never go back to her simple, quiet world. The price of his protection was her past. The price for him was the constant, gnawing fear of losing his only vulnerability. He had exposed his heart to his enemies by caring for her. Later, She stood beside him at the window of his penthouse. The city glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of lights, beautiful and indifferent. It was the same view, but she was a different woman. The purple dress from the gala felt like a costume from another lifetime. She had begged a monster to act like he loved her, a desperate plea to soothe a wounded ego. She had never imagined the performance would become the only truth that mattered. The world outside was dangerous, but in the quiet of this room, with his hand on her back, she felt something that terrified her more than any gun. She felt safe. She felt home. She turned her hand and threaded her fingers through his. He didn't look at her, but his grip tightened, a silent, binding contract. She had made her choice that night in the garage, and again when she gave him the information about the Falcons. Now, she made it again with open eyes. She chose the danger. She chose the darkness. She chose him.